There is one important thing I want to talk to you about before we continue, and this is the scope of a variable. So depending on where you create a variable, it may or may not be accessible from other parts of the program. This is what the scope is about, the visibility of a variable. And let's just see something with an example. Let's just say that here in print triple number, I create a variable a. So I just declare it, okay, I don't initialize it. And now in the main function, I'm doing a is equal to 2. So I declare it here, I initialize it here, or I just modify the value in the main. Now what is going to happen, you can see a was not declared in this scope. Okay, you can see the word scope here. So we have an error because a was not declared in the scope and we can't access a. So from what you have seen before, well, you have seen that you can use a variable in any line after the line where you've declared it. But as you can see here, when you declare a variable inside a function, well, this variable will not be available from outside of the function or from other functions. And the rule is actually more general than that. So now let me explain how the scope works. So in C++, it's quite easy to see that. You can see we have many blocks of code, okay? By a block of code, I refer to a block using curly brackets. Okay, so this is a block of code, this is a block of code, this also, and this also. Inside a function, you can also create, for example, here I could create another block of code, and that's something that we are going to see later on when we work with conditions and loops. This is going to create new blocks of code with curly brackets. And now the rule is that, well, when you declare a variable, so I'm talking about here declaration of the variable, this variable will be accessible from the current scope, which is the current block. Okay, this is the scope of the variable, and from any scope inside this scope. But it is not going to be available from any scope that is outside or before this scope. So if you want to go from this scope to that scope, you need to go out of the first scope and then you lose the visibility of the variable a. So now, for example, let's say that instead of declaring the variable a here, I declare it here. This, when you declare a variable outside of any function, just like that, this is called a global variable, which means that it's going to be available globally. And then I can do, for example, a is equal to 3, here a is equal to 2. As you can see, I can get access to a because here it's declared here. This is a scope that is more nested than this one. So the scope here is basically the scope 0. And then this one also is a scope inside the main global scope. So we can get access to a here and here. And also in that new scope. Okay, I can do a is equal to 4, and I can modify a inside this scope, which is inside this one, which is inside this one. All right, for example, let's say I create a variable b here. Okay, I can use b in this scope, so I can use b after that. I can do b is equal to 4, and I can also use b here. B is equal to 5. Okay, that's going to work. And now if I do int c, as you can see, that's the same thing here. C is not going to work. Why? Here you can see we will have an error. C is undefined. If I run this, you can see C was not declared in this scope because here we have a more nested scope. We declare the variable C, and then we try to access the variable C in a less nested scope. All right, so that's the rule about the scope, and that's a very important rule. And now, well, as you can see here, something that you could see, when we create parameters for functions, actually what's going to happen is that this parameter, int number, this is just like if you create a number variable, int number variable inside the triple number function. So any parameter here will be a variable, and this is going to be what we call a local variable inside the triple number function. So the number, for example here variable, is going to be created here, is going to be used inside the scope of this function, and after that it's going to be destroyed. And it's only going to be available between this curly bracket and this curly bracket. So as you can see, we have two functions. Both of them have a int number variable. But this is not a problem because this is actually different than this. Okay, you can have two different variables with the same name in two different scopes. Okay, as you can see, the number here, it's that one. Number here, it's that one. If I create another int number in the main function, that's going to be yet a different variable because this is one scope, this is another scope, and this is another scope. So three different scopes, three variables with the same name that were declared and created in the three scopes. Well, those are three different variables. So to recap, when you create a variable, pay attention to the scope. A variable is only accessible in its own scope or in any nested scope inside its scope. Thus, you could have different variables with the same name in different scopes. So a very important question to ask yourself when you create a new variable is, where does this variable exist? And in the current scope I'm writing code in, can I access this variable? Knowing this will help you understand some errors when you get started and later on avoid those errors.